The briefing lasted 11 minutes. Cadet 3rd Class Riordan Holt had counted. 11 minutes for a planet that had swallowed 37 previous expeditions whole. 11 minutes for the Galactic Arbitration Council's formal assessment that Varathroman 4 was, in their clinical phrasing, an environment incompatible with sustained biological presence. 11 minutes to tell him he was being sent there alone because the Council needed a body on the ground to satisfy their treaty clause with the Veth Collective, and because, as Senior Arbiter S. Selleck had said while studying a point somewhere above Riordan's left ear, humans are statistically more difficult to kill than other candidate species. That last part was not a compliment. S. Selleck had made that clear with the slow, membrane-shuttered blink that passed for contempt among the Veth. They gave him a drop pod, a 60-day supply ration pack, a handheld atmospheric analyzer, a communicator that worked only in orbital relay range, a personal recording unit, and a standard galactic survey sidearm that he quietly transferred to the bottom of his pack because he had decided, somewhere over the third orbital approach, that if he was going to survive a planet that killed everyone they sent to it, pulling a weapon was probably not going to be the thing that made the difference. The recording unit was for posthumous data collection. The mission debrief notes said so, in small font, on page 42 of a 42-page document. He'd read all 42 pages on the transit. He'd also made a list of everything useful the briefing had failed to mention. That list was considerably longer than the briefing itself. At some point during the third transit day, he'd stopped being afraid and started being annoyed, and he'd decided that was probably a healthier state to arrive in. Annoyed meant thinking. Afraid meant reacting. Reacting on a planet that killed everyone who reacted first seemed structurally counterproductive. He dropped through the cloud layer at 300 local time and hit snow. Not metaphorically. The drop pod's ceramic belly kissed a snowdrift 4 meters deep and sank to a lazy stop, and when Riordan blew the hatch and climbed out into Varathroman 4 atmosphere, the cold hit him like a wall collapsing inward. His breath crystallized instantly. The thermal layer in his suit registered -31 and began compensating, but there was a 3-second lag in the heating mesh, and in those 3 seconds Riordan understood, deeply and personally, why 37 previous expeditions had not filed final reports. He stood on the snow for a moment, blinking ice off his lashes, and looked at the tree line. Varathroman 4 had trees. That was something the briefing had mentioned. It had described them as arboreal structures of unknown biochemical composition reaching heights of 40 to 60 meters. It had not described the way they looked in the dark, the way the bark pulsed with faint orange bioluminescence, like veins lit from the inside, or the way the canopy moved even when there was no wind, a slow and rhythmic shudder as if the forest were breathing. Each tree in its own time and rhythm, but together they made something that was almost a wave, a breathing, a measured respiration working through the darkness in every direction he could see. The briefing had not described the smell, either. Something like iron and pine resin and something older than either, something that sat at the back of Riordan's throat and refused to leave. He shouldered his pack, picked up the recording unit and pressed record. "Cadet 3rd Class Riordan Holt," he said, and his voice was steadier than he'd expected. "Reporting from the surface of Varathroman 4, local time 3:03. Temperature is -31 and my pod is buried to the hatch in a snowdrift. The trees are glowing. Nobody told me the trees glow." He paused, watching the canopy shudder in its long, slow wave. "Starting my perimeter assessment. If you're watching this later and wondering where things went wrong, hi. It was probably the trees." He turned the camera toward the forest and walked. The first thing that surprised him was the wind. There wasn't any. The trees moved, but the air was still, a cold so complete it felt solid, and the canopy's motion had nothing to do with weather. He confirmed this with the atmospheric analyzer, cross-checking pressure gradients and wind speed at multiple heights. The motion originated in the trees. They were moving themselves. He cataloged this as interesting problem for later. Right now he needed shelter, and he needed it before the suit's thermal layer overextended its compensation range, which the manual said was 6 to 8 hours of continuous operation at this temperature differential. He built a shelter in the dark with his headlamp, casting a pale cone through the still air. The pod paneling salvaged cleanly, designed for extraction in hostile conditions. The joints were mechanical rather than welded, and he got the main panels free in 40 minutes. He chose the largest nearby tree, the one whose root system extended most generously along the surface, and built against it, using the roots as one wall and his paneling for the other 3, with a salvaged insulation layer packed between. The root itself was warm. That surprised him again, significantly. He pressed his gloved hand against the bark and felt it, a deep, slow warmth like a fever running underground, nothing that would show on a thermal scan of the surface, but present and definite when you were touching it directly. The tree did not respond to the contact. It did not do anything except continue its measured shuddering, and after a while, Riordan stopped noticing the shudder and started to find it calming, like sleeping next to someone with a steady heartbeat. He was in the shelter before sunrise and asleep within 20 minutes of finishing it, which was not what the briefing would have recommended. The briefing would have recommended a full threat assessment sweep and a perimeter marker deployment and a communication check-in with the orbital relay. But Riordan had decided, at some point over the 3rd transit day, that the 37 expeditions who had died here had probably followed procedure very carefully, and that the specific thing they needed to do differently might be to sleep when they were tired, instead of trying to run threat assessment protocols on a planet that had killed everyone who ran threat assessment protocols on it. He slept. He woke to 2 suns. Varath Roman 4 binary system put a pale yellow primary and a smaller orange secondary into the sky at the same time, at an angle that made the forest look lit from inside and outside simultaneously. The bioluminescence in the bark fading as the ambient light grew but not disappearing entirely, something residual still pulsing at the heartwood when you looked closely. He made his first cup of hot water, not coffee. He'd rationed himself 2 cups of real coffee per week, Sunday and Thursday, and sat outside the shelter drinking it while the forest moved around him. He recorded everything. It was partly protocol and partly something else. He had always been a talker. His training instructors had mentioned it in approximately every performance review, not entirely approvingly. He talked through problems. He narrated. He thought better when the thinking was external, laid out in words he could hear and revise. Alone on Varath Roman 4 with the recording unit for an audience, he talked constantly, a running description of everything he saw and did and thought, and it was useful to him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. It kept his mind organized. It kept him present. It kept the silence from becoming the kind of silence that you start to hear things in. Day 1 Varath Roman 4, he said, mug in hand, forest doing its breathing around him. The binary sunrise is something. Wish I could get a better angle on it, but the canopy blocks the horizon. I'll try to find a clearing later. Shelter is holding at 11 degrees above external good seal. The root system helps. Thermal profile of the tree suggests some kind of geothermal tap. Interesting. No fauna encountered yet, which might mean the noise I made building shelter last night scared everything off, or might mean there's nothing in immediate range, or might mean whatever's out there is too large to be scared. He paused, looking at the tree line's edge where the shadows still pooled. I've decided those are in ascending order of probability. The sound started on day 2. He'd been expecting them in a general sense. The briefing had listed unidentified fauna vocalizations as a hazard category, alongside extreme weather events and unknown biochemical agents. But the briefing had not told him what unidentified fauna vocalizations sounded like when they came out of a still forest in the dark, and the answer was, like nothing he had any useful training for. It started as a high sustained frequency at the edge of his hearing range, a vibration he felt more in his jaw than his eardrums. Then it rose rapidly into something that could only be called shrieking, except that the word was inadequate. It had harmonics. It had layers. It changed while it was happening in ways that suggested either multiple sources or a single source with extraordinary range. It echoed off the tree line and came back changed. It climbed and then dropped and then climbed again in a pattern that was absolutely not random, was structured, was doing something, even if what it was doing was completely opaque to him. He was outside when it started, adding insulation to the shelter's east wall. He stopped. He stood still. Every survival instinct he had been trained with said, assess the direction of the threat, prepare defensive options, make yourself as secure as possible. He stood still and did not do any of those things because he had a theory, and the theory was this. Every expedition before him had done exactly what survival instinct demanded, and every expedition before him was dead. He listened instead. It was, he decided after a while, more like music than like a predator call. Not music the way he understood music, not structured into the shapes his brain expected, but something with the quality of music, the sense of purpose and development and some kind of meaning being encoded into organized sound. He didn't know what the meaning was. He knew in his chest that there was meaning there. Day 2 evening, he said to the recording unit, keeping his voice low and steady, not wanting to interrupt. The shrieking has started. It started about 40 minutes ago and I've been listening rather than running, and I want to report that it sounds intentional, like it's saying something. I don't know what. He paused. I'd like to note for the record that me not running from it is a choice I'm making consciously, and if this turns out badly, I want it on record that it was a choice I considered and made deliberately, not a failure of training. Also, I want it on record that it's beautiful, which I know is not a tactical assessment. But it is true. He stood there until the shrieking stopped, and went to bed, and slept clean through the night without waking. The first 48 hours were a survival problem, which Riordan understood the grammar of. The second 48 were something else, a settling into the shape of this specific place, the way you settle into a new room after the first night and start to understand where the light falls in the morning and which sounds are background and which deserve attention. He had started to understand Varathroman for sounds, not to translate them, not yet, but to categorize them. The shrieking at the forest edge, evening and pre-dawn, occasional, directional. A different sound higher in the canopy, irregular, almost conversational in rhythm. A very low resonance through the root system of his shelter tree, felt in the seat of his pants when he sat on the ground. Constant, varying in intensity, strongest during the binary sunrise. He rationed carefully. The ration packs were dense and tasteless in the efficient way of military nutrition. Everything your body needed, nothing your mind wanted, and he ate exactly what the caloric math required and no more. What concerned him was water. The snow was safe after boiling. The atmospheric analyzer confirmed it, but the fuel situation was finite. He had the heat coil running off the suit's secondary battery, but secondary battery capacity was not unlimited. And once it ran dry, his shelter would hold heat for maybe 12 hours before the temperature differential overwhelmed the insulation. He needed a renewable heat source. He needed fire. Varathroman 4 forest floor was deep in dead material, shed bark, fallen branches, the compressed layers of years of accumulated organic debris that had clearly never known a forest fire. He approached the first tryout cautiously, because alien biochemistry could do anything, because he did not know if this material was flammable or explosive or simply inert, and because he was alone on this planet, and his margin for unexpected catastrophe was smaller than he preferred. He touched a heat coil, set to minimum, to a dry splinter of shed bark. It caught, blue-orange initially, a flicker of something in the bark's chemistry burning off, and then it settled into ordinary orange and threw heat in all directions, and Riordan sat in front of it with his hands out and thought, okay. One thing works like it's supposed to, that's one. He fed the fire carefully, learned its appetite over 2 days, found the combination of materials that burned long and clean versus the ones that burned fast and hot. He dried wood near the heat coil to get a stock that wasn't moisture-heavy. He built a proper fire ring from stones. He built the routine of fire into his daily structure because having a routine was the other thing he decided was essential, separate from survival tactics but equally important. A shape to the day that gave his mind the scaffolding it needed to function at full capacity rather than constant crisis mode. He found the river on day 3. It was frozen on the surface, a crust that his boot heel punched through on the first step, dumping his shin into water cold enough to make him make a sound he would never admit to. A sharp, wordless sound that sent something in the upper branches of the nearest tree into motion, a rustle, and then silence. He scrambled back to the bank, sitting there with his legs steaming in the air, swearing with methodical thoroughness for about 60 seconds, and then looked at the hole he'd made. The dark water moved beneath the ice. Something moved in the water, a flicker of silver near the edge of the hole, catching the light from the bioluminescent bark above, and it was gone before he could fix it. He stared at that hole for a long time. Long enough that the hole began to refrost around the edges. Long enough that whatever had flashed silver could have crossed the river and vanished entirely. He got up, walked back to camp, and started taking apart the pod's navigation array. Day 3, Varathroman 4, he said to the recording unit while he worked. There are fish in the river. New segment. We're going fishing. The hook he made from a circuit wire, a 16-gauge braided conductor with enough memory to hold a bend, worked into a curve around the handle of his multi-tool, and then smoothed with a stone until the profile was right. He'd worked the bend cold to set it, and then heated it briefly to anneal the curve, a trick he'd learned from the same place he'd learned to fish, which was from his grandmother behind her house in a creek so unremarkable it didn't have a name. She taught him with proper hooks, actual fishing tackle, but she'd also taught him the underlying logic of it, and the logic transferred. A hook was a bend with a point at one end and a line attachment at the other. That was all a hook needed to be. The line was the braided polymer cord from the Veth survival pack, 30 kilograms of tensile strength, total overkill for a river fish. Not at all overkill in a river that contained animals he'd never seen and had no size reference for. The rod was a straight branch, peeled smooth where he'd hold it, with a groove cut at the end where the line could seat reliably. He didn't have bait in any form he recognized. He improvised a bit of ration-packed protein bar, dense and calorie-rich, pressed around the hook, and then rolled between his palms into a ball shape. It probably smelled like nothing this river had ever encountered. He thought of that as an advantage. Novelty, in his experience, was generally more interesting than familiarity to most things that could think. He lowered the line through the hole. He sat, he waited. The forest did its thing around him. The canopy shuddered. The low resonance through the ground moved in its usual way, strongest when the binary suns were at their highest angle and tapering in the late afternoon. The shrieking started once, briefly, from well inland, far enough that it was more texture than event, and stopped after a few minutes. Riordan didn't move. His grandmother had said, "You are not here to catch a fish. You are here to be somewhere a fish might come to. That is a different project and it requires a different attitude." He'd been 12 and impatient, and was fairly sure he'd rolled his eyes at this. He was 23 and alone on a planet that had killed 37 expeditions, and he understood it completely now. He felt the pull in his wrist before he saw the line move. He pulled. Steadily, no jerk. Jerking in unknown water with an unknown animal was how you either lost the hook or lost the animal or damaged both. He brought it up hand over hand through the ice hole and into the air. Not a fish, not precisely. It had 2 sets of lateral fins and something that might have been a second mouth cavity, smaller than the primary, along its lateral line. It had flat silver eyes with horizontal rectangular pupils. It had something along its spine that flickered briefly bioluminescent when it came out of the water and then stopped, like a system powering down, like a signal going quiet. It was about the size of a decent-sized trout. He looked at it. It looked back with those flat silver eyes. "Hi," he said. He cleaned it the way he'd been taught, quickly and with respect for the animal, and cooked it on the flat hearthstone he'd set at the edge of his fire. It tasted like char and something faintly mineral, a hard alkaline note underneath the flesh, nothing remotely like trout, and it was the best thing he had eaten since the drop, and he ate it entirely and spent some time afterward just sitting with his hands clasped, looking at the river, feeling the particular combination of cold air and warm fire and full stomach that was the oldest good feeling in human experience. He turned the recording unit around to face him, orange firelight on his face, his first good day on his face. "Day 3, Roman 4, he said and grinned. "I would like to formally announce that the no-return planet has fish. I caught one. I ate it. I'm doing this again tomorrow. If anyone from the council is watching this later and wondering whether your per diem covers the fish, I'd like you to know that the fish are complimentary." He developed a daily structure over the following days. He was not a person who thrived without structure. He had always known this about himself, and Roman 4, which offered absolutely no external structure of any kind, was demanding that he construct his own from scratch. He woke when the double sunrise came. He made fire if it had gone to coals and built it back up, then made water and ate breakfast. He worked the shelter through the morning, maintenance, improvements, cataloging and logging his observations from the previous day in organized notes that he spoke aloud to the recording unit, and then transcribed longhand into the logbook he'd packed. The act of transcription helped him catch inconsistencies in his own observations, things he'd noted without fully registering. In the afternoons, he went to the river. In the evenings, before the shrieking started, he sat with the fire and talked to the recording unit, not about survival logistics, but about whatever he was thinking, whatever had risen to the surface during the day, the things he was trying to work out. He talked about the tree's warmth. He talked about the bioluminescent pulse patterns which he had started charting. He talked about the fish, which he caught every afternoon now with a growing reliability, and which he was learning to prepare in ways that varied the flavor profile, which mattered more than he would have expected when you were alone and eating the same thing every day. He was organized. He was useful to himself. He was, as much as was possible on a planet that had killed 37 expeditions, fine. The sounds in the forest changed on day 4. Not the shrieking that stayed consistent, evening and pre-dawn, its structure familiar now even if its meaning was still opaque. A new sound, lower, more proximate. He heard it first at the edge of the afternoon, a low rumble that had direction to it, that came from somewhere specific rather than diffuse like the tree-line shrieking. He noted it. He didn't move from the river. It was closer on day 5, close enough that he could tell direction and rough distance, maybe 30 meters into the tree line, tracking the river, paralleling him as he walked back to camp in the failing light. He talked to the recording unit about this too. "Something is following me," he said, walking steadily, not hurrying. "Has been for at least 2 days. Sound profile suggests large, moving quietly enough that it's working at it, which means it has the option of being louder and isn't taking it. Animals that are not threats do not follow people. Animals that are threats and are following people are usually being quiet because they are hunting. However," he stepped over a root, adjusted the recorder's angle. "However, an apex predator that was actively hunting me has had 40 minutes of this walk to make a move and hasn't, which is interesting data. Either I'm not worth hunting, which I'm trying not to feel personally about, or the following is the point, and the hunting is not." He paused. "Day 5, he said. "I'm going to light the fire bigger tonight." The thing at the edge of camp arrived that same night. He heard it before he saw it. The quality of its sound was different when it was close, lower, more directed, with a texture almost like intention, like someone choosing their words. It stopped at the tree line. In the early morning dark, the glowing bark threw enough light to see by, and what Riordan saw was large. It was roughly the shape of something that might have evolved in parallel with large Earth predators. The same engineering logic of a deep chest and broad shoulders and low center of gravity, but the resemblance stopped there. Its hide was matte black with a texture like overlapping plates, and its face, if you called it a face, was broad and flat with sensory organs arranged in a ring around a central structure that was not quite a mouth and not quite anything else. It had 6 limbs. 4 for standing, planted wide and solid. 2 that it held forward and bent at complex angles, like hands reconsidered by something that had never seen hands but had arrived at a similar conclusion independently. It stood at the tree line and made its low, directed sound. Riordan sat by his fire. He did not reach for the sidearm at the bottom of his pack. He thought about running, and he thought about what running on this planet tended to mean, and then he thought about his grandmother again. She had a maxim for trail encounters that his parents, who were practical people from the suburbs, had considered borderline unhinged. Don't make it mean something it hasn't told you it means yet. Just watch. Let it tell you. He watched. The creature's sensory ring tracked him with careful precision. He had the sense of being very thoroughly read, scanned at a level that was processing more than just what he looked like, reading heat and scent and sound, and probably frequencies he had no perceptual access to at all. He kept his breathing steady. He kept his hands visible and open. He didn't smile, because he had read enough xenobiology to know that bared teeth were not a universal signal of positive social intent. After 4 minutes or 10, or somewhere in between, it moved. Not toward him and not away, sideways, a few meters along the tree line, then stopped. It sat back on its 4 lower limbs with a slowness that suggested it was doing so deliberately. The sound changed. The frequency shifted upward and it lost the low-register directed quality, took on something higher, something that had in the upper part of its range a quality that Riordan could only describe as questioning. "I don't know what you're saying," he said quietly, not trying to fill the words with anything except ordinary conversation. "But I'm not leaving. Just so we're clear." The questioning frequency stopped. The creature sat. After a moment, it turned its sensory ring not toward him, toward the fire. It watched the fire the way something watches something it has seen before but is deciding whether it currently trusts. Riordan put another branch on and watched it watch the flames. They sat like that until the second sun came up. He named it Smoke on day 6, without making a formal announcement about it, just starting to use the name in his recordings. The coloring earned it. The matte black plates absorbed light in a way that made the creature look less like a solid thing and more like the absence of one, moving through the trees like something dispersing, here and not here and here again, visible only when it chose to be and invisible the rest of the time. He discovered on day 8 that Smoke ate fish. He'd been at his fishing hole when Smoke appeared on the other bank. A thing Smoke could do materialize that Riordan had stopped trying to track after the 3rd time, and stood there for a moment watching him work the line. Then Smoke crossed to his side of the river with 3 steps, found its own spot 6 feet downstream, and drove a forelimb through the ice with a single clean blow that left a perfect circle of open water, edges so precise they looked cut. Then it reached in, not fishing with a hook or a line or any kind of tool, just that 2-jointed forward limb inserted into the water with a patience that matched Riordan's own, and a stillness that was absolute, and then a retrieval that was so fast it barely registered as motion. It came up with something twice the size of anything Riordan had hooked, a thing the length of his forearm, writhing, which Smoke compressed in a precision grip and consumed in approximately 4 bites. Then it looked at Riordan with its ring of sensory organs, and made a sound that had no content he could identify but had, unmistakably, the quality of satisfaction. "Good," Riordan said. It looked at his line, then at him, then at his line again. "Yeah," he said, "that's the same thing." He pulled up a fish of his own, smaller, and Smoke watched him clean it with what Riordan had started to read as interested attention. He held the cleaned fish out. Not toward Smoke's mouth, not that presumptuously, but in Smoke's direction, a question framed as an offer. Smoke took it from his hand with the careful gripper forelimb, examined it, and ate it in one efficient motion. Then it went back to fishing. "Okay," Riordan said. He baited the hook again. "We're doing this." They fished side by side for 2 hours. Smoke's method and Riordan's method produced roughly the same results in terms of catch rate but different results in terms of size. Smoke's deep current hunting pulled up the larger animals, while Riordan's surface tension work got more total volume in smaller individuals. Between them, by the time the suns crossed noon, they had a substantial pile on the bank. Smoke sorted through it. Riordan wasn't sure if sorted was the right word, but there was clearly a taxonomy being applied, some fish set aside in one grouping, some in another, the basis of which Riordan couldn't quite determine. When Smoke was done, it pushed one of the groupings toward him, not aggressively. With the same quality of deliberateness, he was starting to recognize as Smoke's characteristic mode of doing things. Nothing wasted, everything intentional. Riordan looked at the grouping it had pushed toward him, then at the one it kept for itself. He did not have the analytical equipment to determine the chemical difference between them, but he decided to trust the distinction and marked the characteristics of his grouping as well as he could for future reference. The shape of the secondary fin, the coloration variation on the spine, things he could recognize in the water if he learned to look for them. He recorded all of it. "Day 8 Verathroman 4, he said, watching Smoke efficiently process its half of the catch while he processed his. "My companion, the Vreth-class apex predator I've been calling Smoke, has established what I can only describe as a cooperative fishing arrangement. He takes the deep column, I take the surface, we split the catch, and it appears there's a quality distinction he's able to make that I can't yet, but that I'm going to spend the next few days trying to understand. I want to be very clear that I am not the senior partner in this arrangement. He is a significantly better fisherman than I am, and he knows it." He paused, watching Smoke's forelimb work. "He makes a sound after every good catch that I have started calling the showing-off sound. It is very pointed." On day 11, it snowed in a way that was different from the ambient background snowfall that had been constant since his arrival. The atmospheric analyzer clocked the incoming pressure system at 600 and the barometric drop was steep, faster than any weather event he'd seen yet. But what actually told him was the forest. The shudder in the canopy, that constant breathing rhythm that he'd stopped registering as notable, stopped. All of it, everywhere at once as far as he could see in any direction. The trees went perfectly, completely still. The low resonance through the ground dropped to silence. Even the distant shrieking, which he now understood to be the forest's evening communication mode, simply quit. That silence was the loudest thing he'd heard since he arrived. He had 3 hours before the front hit. He used them. He got the shelter reinforced before the first wall of snow reached the tree line. Additional paneling braced at the windward corner, the polymer cord run in a web pattern through the root system to distribute loading, the entrance narrowed to reduce heat loss. He moved 3 days of firewood inside, dried and stacked. He got his water boiled and stored while he still had clear air to do it in. When the snow came, it came sideways and fast. A wall of white that dropped visibility to 2 meters and the temperature by 9 degrees in 40 minutes. And he was inside with the fire up and the heat coil running and his notes in front of him before the worst of it hit. Smoke was already there. He hadn't seen or heard Smoke come in. The creature was simply in the far corner of the shelter when he entered it, folded down on its 4 lower limbs with the forward limbs tucked under itself, and it was doing the thing with the plates. He'd seen this in warm conditions as a cooling mechanism, the plates lifting slightly to release heat, but now running in reverse, the plates pressing together and layering more tightly, trapping air in the microscopic gaps between them. A distributed insulation system built into the animal's body. The shelter temperature went up 4 degrees just from its presence, and Riordan was not going to say anything about this, because he was not going to do anything that might make it leave. He worked. He had his observation log and his star charts. He'd been mapping Verathroman 4 sky with his eyes and a hand-drawn grid, building a picture of the binary system's dynamics, and he had the bioluminescence pulse records, which he was now 3 weeks of data into and which were refusing to resolve into anything simple. The pattern was there. He could feel the shape of it every time he sat with the data, but the resolution point kept moving. Smoke watched him work. At some point, the creature's sensory ring stopped tracking the shelter entrance and started tracking him, following the motion of his hands on the log book, the angle of his head when he looked up to think, the rhythm of his breath when something in the data caught his attention. It was not threatening attention. It was the attention of something genuinely curious. "I know," Riordan said to it, not looking up. "I'm trying to see a pattern in the pulse data and I can't quite get there. There are 22 days of records here. 22 data points isn't enough to resolve a pattern that might operate on a longer cycle." He turned a page. "Or I'm looking at the wrong variable. I keep indexing to temperature because that's the most obvious environmental covariate, but it might be something I can't measure. Time of year. Something orbital. Gravitational tidal flux from the binary system. That would explain why the resonance through the root system is strongest at binary noon." He looked up. Smoke's ring tracked him. "Does that mean anything to you?" Smoke made the questioning sound. "Yeah," Riordan said. "I thought not." He went back to the data. The storm broke 6 hours later, the silence after storm, which was the cleanest quality of silence Riordan had experienced on the planet, a silence that had accomplished something and was now resting. The forest began to stir again slowly. The first shudder returned to the canopy, far away and tentative, building back toward normal. The low resonance came back through the roots, and the shelter tree warmed perceptibly, and Riordan sat in the restored warmth and felt something he identified, with some surprise, as home. Smoke uncurled and went to the entrance and looked out at the new snow for a long time. Then it made a sound Riordan had heard only once before, on day 6, when it had located something under the snow at the forest edge and investigated it with sustained attention. The careful sound, not the questioning frequency and not the showing-off sound, and not the evening communication that he'd started to think of as its social mode. The careful sound was specific to situations where there was something that mattered and that required deliberate attention. He picked up the recording unit. "The careful sound," he said. "We're going." 1/2 kilometer into the forest, through snow that came to his knees in the drifts and to his shins on firm ground, Smoke stopped. Riordan had learned to read Smoke stops. There were different qualities of them, the same way there were different qualities of the sounds. This stop had weight to it, the weight of something significant being presented rather than pointed to. It said, "Here," not, "Wait here, here." The structure was half buried in new snow. He might have walked past it without the stop. It was not large, 3 meters across, dome-shaped, made of something that was not quite the same as Smoke's hide but was clearly related material, the same overlapping plate logic applied at an architectural scale. It was warm. The same deep warmth as the trees, the same geothermal tap, maintained through whatever system ran below the surface of this forest. Snow had settled on it and not melted, which meant the exterior was insulated. The heat was held inside, not radiating outward. Smoke would not cross within 10 meters of it. It sat at that radius and made the careful sound again, once. Riordan went in. The interior was dry and ordered. The order was the first thing that registered, not the randomness of natural accumulation, but the deliberate organization of a taxonomy. each object isolated from its neighbors, and associated with small markings in a material he couldn't identify applied to material he also couldn't identify. He moved slowly, reading the room with his headlamp and his eyes and his atmospheric analyzer. There were fragments of previous expedition gear, plenty of it. A Veth collective breathing mask, the kind issued to their xenobiologists, not their security personnel. A radio unit, standard galactic survey issue, disassembled with care rather than damaged. A sealed sample case, external labels intact, contents not disturbed. A boot. A pair of gloves. Things that had belonged to people who were dead, organized and preserved by something that had apparently found them significant. He stood in the center of the structure and looked at the 37 expedition's remains and felt, not grief exactly, but something adjacent to it, the weight of all those people who had arrived where he had arrived and had not got to fish with smoke or sit out a blizzard in a shelter root's warmth. What he found in the very center of the structure made him sit down on the cold floor. A recording device. Alien. The housing was an unfamiliar material, the interface a set of pressure-sensitive nodules in a configuration that took him a few minutes to experiment with. When he found the right nodule combination, a holographic projection appeared in the air above it, three-dimensional and detailed, and it showed him things the briefing had absolutely never mentioned. Verathroman 4 from above, the orbital view he'd been denied by the pod's descent angle. Then deeper through the crust into the geological structure, vast chambers he had no reference for, and moving through those chambers something that was alive. Something that moved with the same slow rhythm as the trees, the same pulse he'd been trying to resolve in his bioluminescence charts, and suddenly from this angle, from the inside, the pattern was visible. The trees were not trees the way he understood trees. They were nodes. Transmission points. The forest was a surface expression of something vast and ancient and deeply rooted in the rock itself, and the pulse pattern in the bioluminescence was the system's signal traffic, and the low resonance through the root systems was not geothermal at all. It was the signal carrier wave, the medium through which the whole thing communicated. The shrieking in the forest wasn't fauna. It was the planet's voice. The distributed intelligence of something so large and old that it had never needed to concentrate into anything like a brain, because every part of it was already in contact with every other part. The planet was paying attention. It had been paying attention to every expedition that arrived, and it had noticed him, the fire, the routine, the recordings, the careful approach to everything he didn't understand, the still mornings at the fishing hole. The dome was not a trap or a memorial. It was a study collection. The planet's research station for the strange, small things that kept arriving from the sky. He sat in the alien structure with 37 expedition fragments around him and thought about that for a while. Then he picked up the recording unit. Day 11, he said. I found something. I've been wrong about something important and I want to get it on record before anything else happens. He looked at the hologram, the deep, slow breathing of a world that was awake. I've been treating Verathroman 4 as an environment to survive, a context that I need to manage and navigate and extract myself from intact. But the planet, he paused, parsing it out. The planet has been treating me as something to study. Every expedition before me showed up and either panicked at the sounds, or tried to force contact, or just ran their protocols until their systems failed. And every time the planet registered that as data and filed it. And I showed up and made a fire and went fishing and talked to everything out loud. And the planet apparently finds this interesting enough to keep track of in more detail. He looked around at the organized fragments. Which means, he said, we've been studying each other, same project, neither of us panicked. He turned the unit toward the hologram. Hi, he said. I'm Riordan Holt. I've been here 11 days. I caught a fish yesterday. I thought you should know. Dr. Shaitethek arrived on day 14, which was either a coincidence or evidence of the planet's communication capabilities extending to the orbital relay, and Riordan was increasingly confident it was the latter. The xenobiologist was Veth collective, bipedal, with membrane eyes and the general affect of someone who had been doing field work in difficult conditions for a long time and had found a way to be professional about it. The environment suit was good quality expedition grade, with research equipment integrated into the forearm panels. The badge on the chest said Dr. Shitethek, Xenobiology Division, Research Grade 4. The expression, when the xenobiologist approached the perimeter of Riordan's camp, cycled through several states before settling on something Riordan had to read as alarm. Smoke was sitting at his left side. "Cadet Holt," said Dr. Shitethek in accented but fluent standard, "please explain the Vreth." "This is Smoke," Riordan said. "Smoke is a local apex predator who has been sharing my camp since day 5 and who I've been running a cooperative fishing arrangement with. He takes the deep column, I take the surface. We had a catch of about 12 kilograms yesterday. I named him Smoke because of the coloration." He watched the xenobiologist's membrane cycle. "Is there something wrong with him?" "The Shitethek process something. Cadet Holt, the Vreth have killed 17 of the 37 expeditions documented on this planet." "I know, I read the briefing. The other 20 died from other causes, which suggests a complex ecosystem rather than a single specific hazard." Riordan looked at Smoke. Smoke was watching Dr. Shitethek with its sensory ring, the attentive reading mode. "Smoke has never shown aggressive behavior toward me. My working theory is that the Vreth aggression in the documented cases was territorial response to human behavior that registered as threat, the panic responses, the weapons draw, the abrupt movements. Smoke and I started building our arrangement because I sat still at a fire and waited, and didn't make it mean anything until it told me what it meant." "That," said the xenobiologist slowly, "is not how any previous expedition has approached Vreth contact." "I know. They all use standard contact protocols. The Galactic Survey Manual specifies." The Galactic Survey Manual was developed from observations of species that are not apex predators on planets with distributed planetary intelligence. Yes. Riordan had worked this out over the past week. I think the standard protocols read as either threat displays or prey responses to the Vreth, and neither of those ends well. Smoke made the questioning sound. It was directed at Dr. Shitethek. The xenobiologist went still in a way that was different from Riordan's stillness by firelight. This was the stillness of something receiving unexpected input at a high volume. "What did it say?" Riordan asked. Shitethek's membranes move through states too fast to read. "It asked what my purpose is in its territory. And I said I was here to observe the human specimen." Riordan looked at the xenobiologist. "The human specimen," he repeated. "The Council deployed me when your first transmission packets were received. They did not. The membranes moved in a way Riordan was learning to read as sheepish, or the closest Veth equivalent. They did not expect you to survive past day 4. The biome lock weather event on your second day was rated as a lethal class weather event. Your shelter appeared inadequate by survey standards. I reinforced it before the front hit. The canopy stopped moving and tipped me off that something was incoming." "The canopy," Shitethek stopped. "You read the canopy's motion as a weather indicator." "Consistently, yes. It has at least 4 distinct motion states I've cataloged." He watched the xenobiologist absorbing this. "I had help with the weather event, actually. Smoke came into the shelter, and the heat differential from his body kept the temperature 4 degrees higher than my equipment alone would have managed. Also, the root system of my shelter tree appears to have been doing something with its thermal output. It was warmer during the storm than at any other time, which suggests the forest network was actively managing my shelter's temperature." Shitethek's membrane response to this was the one Riordan hadn't seen before, a full-surface slow shimmer that meant, as he'd later learn, something between reverence and scientific crisis. "You are saying," the xenobiologist said very carefully, "that the planetary biosystem was actively supporting your survival." "I'm saying the data is consistent with that, yes." He looked at the forest. "I'm also saying I showed it my appreciation by talking to it, which is either meaningful or not, but it felt respectful, and I think respect was probably the variable the other 37 were missing." Dr. Sci-Fi set up a research station 50 meters from Riordan's camp. At a distance, they'd negotiated to Smoke's satisfaction. The negotiation had taken 2 hours and had involved a considerable amount of the careful sound from Smoke, a considerable amount of xenobiological expertise from Sci-Fi, and considerable moderating from Riordan, who was becoming fluent enough in Smoke's signal vocabulary to catch when the questioning frequency was genuine inquiry versus when it was establishing a position. They established a protocol for the research station's approach paths. Sci-Fi agreed not to use active scanning equipment inside Smoke's established territory radius without Smoke's expressed consent, which was a diplomatic formulation that the xenobiologist found professionally interesting and personally challenging, but ultimately conceded as scientifically correct. In exchange, Riordan agreed to bring Sci-Fi into the dome structure, which the xenobiologist had been trying to document for 4 previous expeditions without ever managing to get inside. Walking into the dome for the second time with a xenobiologist beside him felt different. Sci-Fi's membrane responses to the organized expedition materials were careful and controlled in the way of professional restraint over genuine disturbance. The holographic recorder, when Riordan found the right nodule sequence, produced the same orbit-to-interior projection, and this time Riordan watched the xenobiologist's face while it played. "The Vreth know about this," Sci-Fi said after a long silence. "I think they're part of it, yes. Not the same as the tree network. They're individual, they have individual memory and personality. Smoke is definitely not the same as any other Vreth I've seen, and from what I can tell has a personal relationship with the forest system that is its own thing. But they're native to this system. They evolved inside it. They can read it in ways I can't. This is why the Vreth has not killed you." Sci-Fi's voice was processing something. "The planetary system has flagged you as something to keep track of, yes. I think when the system registers something as worth studying rather than worth expelling, the Vreth respond to that signal. Not consciously, maybe just as instinct. But the effect is the same. And you believe you triggered this response by sitting still by a fire and going fishing." Riordan looked at the hologram. "And talking, a lot." The xenobiologist's membrane cycled in a way that might have been disbelief, or might have been the beginning of understanding. Riordan was getting better at reading Veth membrane states, but they were still not entirely transparent to him. "I would like," Sci-Fi said, after a long moment, "to help you with the communication work. The frequency range analysis. I have equipment that can resolve the signal components your recording unit cannot." "I would like that," Riordan said. They went a fish. In the 2 weeks that followed, Riordan finished mapping the dome's contents and wrote his first systematic report on the planetary biosystem. He did this with Sci-Fi's equipment and expertise, and with Smoke's apparent endorsement, because the creature began to appear at the edges of their working sessions with a regularity that seemed deliberate and an attentiveness that was certainly not accidental. He also wrote the protocol document. It was the thing he kept coming back to, the thing that felt like the most necessary output of all of this, more necessary than the biosystem report or the communication framework or the dome's catalog, because those things answered questions the council and the scientific establishment were asking. But the protocol document answered a different question. Why did 37 people die here, and what would have helped them instead? The answer was embarrassingly simple once he could see it clearly. They died because they'd treated Varathroman 4 as a problem to overcome. They'd brought their protocols and their equipment and their training, all of which were designed to help humans operate in hostile conditions. And they'd run those protocols efficiently and carefully, and every single one of them had treated the strangeness of the planet as a threat rather than a communication. The planet had been trying to communicate. The forest's voice, the canopy's signals, the Vreth's boundary behaviors, even the dome structure with its meticulous collection. All of it was a planet that had been paying attention to visitors for 400 years and finding, consistently, that the visitors were not paying attention back. The protocol document said, "Pay attention back." It said, "Sit still." It said, "Make fire," which is the universal sign of a presence that intends to remain. It said, "Make sounds because the planet's network operates partly in acoustic signal and will attempt to meet you where you are." It said, "Fish," or do whatever is the equivalent of fishing, patient, deliberate, respectful engagement with the planet's resources. It said, "Record everything, out loud, in organized narrative, because the act of narrating out loud produces acoustic signal with the specific quality of intelligence, and the planet's network can read it." It said at the bottom, which Riordan almost didn't include but did, "Bring your curiosity, not your courage. Courage is useful when something needs to be fought. This planet doesn't need to be fought. It needs to be paid attention to. Bring the quality of mind that can sit next to something enormous and unknown, and simply wait to understand what it is." He sent it to S. Selleck with a cover note. This is what the other 37 needed to know. The Council's communication came back in 11 hours, which was fast. Senior Arbiter S. Selleck's voice had the particular quality of control it had when processing something that required recalibration at a fundamental level. "Cadet Holt, the Council has reviewed Dr. Shitethek's preliminary field reports and your own transmissions. Several items require clarification." "Sure," Riordan said. He was at the river. Smoke was working the deep column 6 feet to his right. The recording unit was on its rock, capturing the fishing light. "What do you need?" "The Vreth." "Smoke." "Yeah." "You have established a sustained cooperative relationship with a Vreth-class predator. Fishing partnership primarily. Some shelter sharing during weather events. We're also collaborating on the frequency mapping work. He can hear ranges I can't, and when I use a whistle system to generate tones in his range, he responds in ways that Shitethek can analyze. We've got over 60 reliable signal response pairs now." 60? The pause was long. "The Veth Collective has been attempting non-aggressive Vreth contact for 400 years. I know. I think the problem was the contact attempts themselves. You approached it as a contact attempt. I approached it as sitting next to someone I didn't want to bother." Riordan's line went tight. He played it, brought it up, a good-sized one of the spine-flash variety that Smoke had categorized for him weeks ago. "The Council," S. Selleck said, "has also reviewed the recordings from the dome structure, the planetary biosystem data. That changes things, I know. The no-return classification was never really about the planet being incompatible with sustained biological presence. It was about previous expeditions being incompatible with this specific planet's communication requirements." He freed the fish from the hook, held it in both hands for a moment, the cold weight of it, the alien silver eyes. "The planet is fine. We're the variable." The pause this time lasted long enough that Riordan cleaned and set aside the fish and baited the hook again. "The Council," S. Selleck said finally, in the tone of someone issuing a verdict they are still processing, "has rescinded the no-return classification. Varathroman 4 will be reclassified as restricted access, specialized protocol required. The protocol will be attributed to you." Another pause. "We are dispatching a full research team. They will arrive within 30 days. We would like you to." "I'll need to check with Smoke," Riordan said. On the team size and approach parameters. You will, Selig stopped. You will consult the Vreth. It's his territory. It's the planet's territory. I'm a guest. He looked at Smoke, who had just come up with something large and was making the showing off sound in a pointed manner. A guest that's been doing pretty well at the fishing, I want to be clear, but a guest. Cadet Holt. Selig's voice was doing something Riordan had never heard from a Veth before, something very quiet and very careful. In 400 years of galactic survey presence in this sector, not one expedition, not one individual, has achieved what you have achieved on this planet. I sat by a fire, Riordan said, and I went fishing. You. My grandmother taught me both. She used to say the point is being somewhere that something might come to, not going somewhere to make something happen. He watched Smoke working the river, that patient, exquisite expertise. She was right. She was right about a lot of things. Riordan ended the communication and sat with the river for a while, in the cold amber light of the binary afternoon, with Smoke at his side and the forest doing its living around them both, the breathing and the pulses, and the low resonance through the ground that he understood now as the planet listening, always listening, to the strange small things that arrived from the sky. He picked up the recording unit. Day 50, he said. The no-return planet is no longer classified as no-return. I have been given the completely terrifying title of protocol author, which means I now have administrative responsibilities, which I did not sign up for and intend to discuss with someone. He turned the unit toward the river, toward Smoke still working the deep column, still pulling up things Riordan couldn't manage on his own. I also want to say, for whoever watches this later, because someone is going to watch this later in a training context, and I know that the thing they don't tell you about being sent somewhere impossible is that impossible is usually just a failure of attention. 37 people died here because they treated this place as a problem to solve. It wasn't a problem. It was a conversation they didn't know how to start. He paused. You start it, he said, by sitting still long enough to hear what's already being said. The forest shuddered. The bioluminescence moved in its pulse pattern, and he understood enough of it now to read the rhythm as something like greeting or attention or simply, yes, we are still here. We are still listening. Yeah, he said, me too. He set the unit on its rock and picked up his rod and let his line back into the water, and Smoke's sensory ring tracked the line's entry into the current with an attention that was, at this point, almost fond, and they fished together in the amber light of a planet that had been waiting 400 years for someone to sit down and stay a while. The vlog hit 60 days. The Council's archivist requested the full footage. Riordan sent it with a subject line that read, "From the no-return planet, we're doing fine." He attached a photo of Smoke, the two of them at the fishing hole, Smoke looking at the camera with its ring of sensory organs and Riordan grinning with a fish held up in both hands. His grandmother would have insisted on the photo. She always documented the good catches. He figured this counted.